Hello everyone, today we're going to be getting into some controversy by ranking every single season of Beyblade. Well, technically every season except for one, and that's the second season of X. That season didn't come out until after I already finished rewatching the entire anime, so it won't be included, but maybe in a future video when I update the tier list, it'll be included, but for now it won't be included. What we're basically gonna do is we're gonna be going over every single season, seeing what's good and what's crap that I shouldn't have wasted my time on, and we're gonna be ranking them in a tier list. Right here on screen, we'll be showing how the tiering works and why some seasons are ranked the way they are. So, without further ado, let's start off with the first season. Bakutenshu Beyblade, the season that started it all. We're starting off with a banger in the great tier. I think the first season is spectacular. It's a well put together season with great character work and battles. The season was also the only season with hand-drawn battles before we got the CGI battles from the second season onwards. I like the main cast in the season a lot. The main protagonist, Tyson, is fantastic and goes through great development. Kai, Max, and Ray all have their own distinctive personalities, with all of them getting focused and being enjoyable. In this season, you basically have the whole thing with the tournament going on, and Tyson and the gang traveling and battling. Not to mention side characters, antagonists like Boris, who is very well written. He's basically a jerk and a manipulative scumbag. And Talo was also done very well, with him being the final foe that Tyson has to overcome in the end. The season also introduces to a lot of stuff like Bit Beast and Sacred Bit Beast, and I overall, from start to finish, really like the season a lot. V-Force was a bit of a step down from the original, but still in the great tier though. What's notable about this season is that there's a clear shift in art style between this season and the previous one, and it does take a little while before you get used to it, but eventually you'll get used to it. I'll say that V-Force is a well-written enough season with some great lore building. This season also introduced some new characters to extend the cast even further, like the new main cast member Hillary, and some side characters like the Saint Shields, who were a very enjoyable group, and as well as that group of scientists who were trying to steal the Bit Beast. The finale between Tyson and Zio, I think, was done exceptionally well, and is definitely the best part of the season in my opinion. When we found out that Zio was a robot, I think it's a solid season overall, on par with the original series, so therefore it gets a spot in the great tier. And now we have G-Revolution. This is where we start picking up the pace. It's a peak season for me, mainly because I enjoy watching this season a lot. I do have some criticism though, which are Daichi, the new secondary protagonist, who was technically introduced in the Fierce Battle movie, but we won't go into that, and how Talo was handled. I think Daichi is absolute garbage, and I think he is basically a gag character with unfunny jokes. And for Tala, it's basically that he was basically doing something interesting in the story, trying to face Boris and trying to stop him and Vega to like take over the blading world or something, I don't know. And they just put him in a coma and left him out for the rest of the season, which was kind of disappointing. The rest of the season is fire though. The teams were handled great. The battles were fantastic. Brooklyn was the antagonist, was very cool. And the season overall was just well put together and a very enjoyable season. So that's why I'm gonna give it a spot on the peak tier. MFB Season 1 is gonna be a great season for me. I have a soft spot for this season due to it being the very first season I watched. The season introduces a whole new cast of characters, with all of them having their own distinctive personalities. The new protagonist, Jinga Hagane, is a fantastic character. His journey from losing and reuniting with his dad to eventually having to get over his emotions was, I think, in my opinion, a bit more interesting than Tyson's story. The story from episode 20 onwards is to gather points to enter the Battle Bladers tournament, with the Battle Bladers arc being done pretty well for the most part. I didn't really have any complaints with it. The final battle between Ryuga and Jenga was done very, very well, and don't think the season did anything too well to excel at it. It's just a likable enough start to a new generation. Metal Flight Explosion has got to be the best season of the Metal Flight generation. It's a peak season by far. The season focuses on Jinga, Masamune, Yu, and Tsubasa taking on the World Tournament. This tournament was very interesting, and we got to see a lot of new and familiar faces along the road, like Team Starbreaker and Excalibur, who were probably my favorite new teams that were introduced in this season. However, there's one thing besides the main cast in the World Tournament which got a lot of focus, and that's the character of Toby. Toby is a guy who Masamune, along with a friend of him called Zio, met up with in America, where Masamune learned to Beyblade. Toby eventually got sick and needed care, and during this time where Toby was in the hospital, the Battle Bladers arc was on TV. Masamune saw Jingo win, and eventually he left to Japan in order to challenge Jinga, leaving Zio and Toby behind. This angered Zio, making him join the HD Academy to become a stronger Blader and participate in the World Tournament. This leads to the finale of the tournament, where Jingo must fight Damien Hart, a member of the American team, for the title. Jingo won and became champion with his team, and that's basically how the World Tournament ends. I really like the arcs where Tsubasa goes through this dark phase. Also, Ryuga coming back to master his Bay El Drago, not wanting anything with the dark power anymore, nothing power hungry. And overall, all this adds up to be a peak season. 40 is up next. This is the first season that I've ranked below the grade tier, and for good reasons. First of all, I hate the build up to Nemesis Revival. I think it was stupid and a waste of time to put its focus on. Speaking of Nemesis, I feel like Rago was a bit too generic of a villain. The Bane Nemesis, however, is cool, but I would have appreciated this season a bit more if they put more effort into Rago as a character. I think the pacing during the start of this season was absolute ass. However, it does pick up near the middle and the end, so that's at least something. I also think that this anime, the season of the anime, basically screwed up Ryuga's entire character, with him going back to power hungry after going through 2 seasons of development, with him not wanting anything to do with the dark power, nothing power hungry. So that was a little disappointment. Speaking of characters, I absolutely hate Yuki. I think Yuki is just an absolute garbage character, basically like Daichi. However, this season does have some stuff that's redeemable in it. Like the new gimmicks introduced during this season, and they work really well in battle, I think, for the most part. Jingo was great as always, and the OST and the finale were basically awesome. Overall, this season was a decent enough season that started a bit rough, but ended up pretty solid. What's surprising is that I have Zero G ranked above 40 in the good tier. I like Zero G. I think it's a well enough paced season with a decent enough main cast. This is the only season of Metal Fight Beyblade without Jingo as the protagonist, with him being replaced by Zero Kurigane. I think Zero is just okay. I'm not really like the biggest fan of him, but I don't dislike him like characters such as Yuki or Daichi, for example. I think Zero was developed well enough during this season, with him learning to be stronger with the help of some familiar faces like Benkei. The villains were kind of just crap in this season. I had no real interest to characters like Kira or Yoshio. They weren't very interesting. I thought Bayu was actually pretty cool. He was basically like a character that came to aesthetics looked very similar to Rei. I don't think this season does anything fantastic, but I think it's a nice enough season. However, I don't think it's anything like great or anything. It's just good. And now we have Burst. We're going back to the peak seasons with this one. I think season 1 of Burst is fantastic. It's a very character-focused season. There's a lot of character work in the first season of Burst compared to other seasons. I like the take that this season's trying to go for by focusing more on the characters and what they're doing compared to, let's say, the battles. The season also introduces us to a new main character in Vault Ahoy. I love Vault. He's my favorite protagonist by far, and I think the villain in this season was also a very solid one in Louis Shirasagi wielding the Bay Lost Luinor. The season had a decent enough finale, although Vault was basically cheated of his win. Everything felt very fresh, and it was a definite step up from Metal Fight in my opinion. Therefore, it earns a spot on the peak tier. However, taking the crown is Beyblade Burst Evolution, or God. I know this pick is a little controversial, but please hear me out. The second season, in my opinion, is fantastic. Obviously, from the first season to the second season, we have Vault, the protagonist, and I think he had really great progression in this season, with him basically having to change his ideology of blading and having to take battling more seriously on the international podium, which I think was a nice change from the first season. There's a lot of content in this season. It's basically a world tournament for the first half, European tournament, and then the world tournament. And with the second half of it being with like the Shadow Bladers and the International Blading Cup and Free coming back to BC Seoul and stuff like that. And I think all of that was handled pretty well for the most part. I think Shu as a villain was done very, very well this season. I think the ending was fantastic with Vault becoming the world champion and Shu being saved from his red-eye persona. I think overall this season is a well-paced and well-put-together season with a great cast of characters, except for Stan Hamburg. I don't know what the hell they were thinking with writing him. Overall, the best season in my opinion. Fight me. Now we have Beyblade Burst Turbo, or Cho Z, which I've ranked as a good season. The bottom of good though. This is an interesting enough season because we have a new protagonist to follow, which is Iger Akabane. But I think Iger just isn't as interesting as Vault in my opinion. I think his progression was handled fine. It wasn't anything special, but it wasn't anything horrible, so that's something I do appreciate. I did like the whole thing with the dark powers that Iger goes through, with him having to basically reform his resonance with Achilles after possessed by these dark powers, and Achilles and Iger having a dark resonance together. I think the villains were absolutely at its peak in this season with Fine. I think he's probably the best villain in Beyblade Burst, and potentially maybe even the best villain in Beyblade as a whole, at least in my opinion. Love the Battleship Cruise arc. It's probably one of my favorite arcs in the anime, and I think it was handled really well with the battles. The finale wasn't very good compared to the Iger versus Five battle. I think the finale could have been more fleshed out and done better than it ended up being. During the battle, you could clearly see that Vault was meant to win with the hits taken during the final battle, but Iger got plot armor and somehow ended up winning, which was kind of disappointing for me as a Vault fan. But I think overall, like, it wasn't anything terrible. I did like the battle though. I think it was pretty good. I was hesitant on putting this season in mid because there is clearly a lot of stuff I don't like about it. However, I think it's barely good enough to rank in the good tier. Next up is Beyblade Burst GT, or Beyblade Burst Rise. And surprisingly, I think this deserves a spot on the great tier. Man, we are on a roll today. Every season so far has been good or better. Will there ever be a season that's bad? We'll get to those in a bit. Anyhow, where was I? Oh yeah, Rise. The season was kind of hard for me to rank because there's one big thing that this season doesn't really have, and that's, drum roll please, a story. Like, seriously, what's the story in this season? I can't even answer this. I rewatched every single episode, still don't know what's the story in this season. This thing called Hyperflux that was introduced in this season, which I think was cool, but in hindsight, it was just a poorly executed marketing trick to have you buying a Bay in the hope of getting a 1 out of 72 chance Hyperflux variant, which was basically just a gamble, but it's whatever, I guess. On a bit more positive note, I think the cast of characters is cool enough. The main character, Dante Koryu, was a well-written enough main character, and he was pretty enjoyable. Side characters were a little hit or miss, but I do like most of them. Characters like Armin were actually good, and others like Arthur and Fumia were just not interesting and were utilized a bit weird in the story though. I thought Gwen was actually really cool, so that's something. You might be wondering why I'm ranking this season so high, and I honestly don't know why I'm ranking it so high, because just like basically any season of Beyblade Burst and maybe a couple of Metal Fight seasons, it doesn't really have anything that's well done enough to excel at, but I think just like the first season, it was a unique take that I liked enough. However, maybe in a future ranking, I may end up changing the placement of this season, putting it a bit lower than I originally planned. But for now, I'm putting this in the grade tier. Let's move on. And then we have Beyblade Burst Sparking or Beyblade Burst Surge. The season sucks. I think this season is absolutely awful, and in my opinion is the worst season of Beyblade as a whole. Firstly, the new characters suck. Like, actually. They're so bad. The protagonists for this season were among the worst ones in Beyblade. Even bad enough to rival Daichi and Yuki, which are Hyuga and Hikaru, the new protagonists. They feel very uninspiring and bland. Like, Hyuga's thing is saying vroom vroom kablam and being very energetic. Hikaru is this wannabe hero who basically does poses and acts very confident, I think. That's basically it for those two, and I think the same can be said about the antagonist with Lane Valhalla. Lane is basically the definition of yelling flair. That's pretty much it. He really has no depth to him and isn't written very well. Like, before you're bombarding your head with ideas saying that my opinion is ass, listen, take a listen, please. Non-depth to little depth antagonists can be good. A good example would be Ryuga. But Lane just isn't that good. He would have been good if he was actually executed properly, which he isn't. I think this villain actually had a really good premise behind him, but he eventually got bland very quickly. The season was basically marketed as a season of fan service, with all the legends coming back. And for some of Sparking, I think it was done well enough, but it didn't feel like the grand return that you would have expected from this season. Also, the pacing isn't very good in this season, and how the story was told was quite poor. And I think once we get to Cutie, it didn't get much better, and in some cases, it got even worse. Belle was hardly an improvement to the previous season's protagonist. However, he's basically just this kid who dresses up like Dracula and pranks people. Rashad, which is this season's antagonist, is terrible as well. If you thought Lane was a bad antagonist, no. Let me tell you, Rashad is even worse. His entire character isn't written very well, and the season itself doesn't really help explain his character well enough either. So when you're watching this season, you can get confused by basically all of his motives. Just like the previous season, it wasn't paced very well, and this dragged a lot during the second half of the season. The season also did characters like Vault very dirty, making him very ignorant. An example of this is when Felix Payne shows up, showing off his new Phoenix. Vault basically said, I wonder how it battles, because he saw the shield attachment. And I got to thinking, like, what the hell? There was literally an antagonist with the same bait, with the same gimmick 2 seasons ago, who literally challenged Vault and had plenty of battles in this season. So his gimmicks were showing off, and they they just made Vald so ignorant, and I don't know why. Or when Valtryek was on literally the brink of breaking, he notices signs of the breakage and yet still battles. Again, what the hell? Who in the right minds of the anime staff thought this was a good idea? I seriously don't know. Overall, this season sucks as well. However, I thought it could get a slight edge over Sparking because I thought it was a bit more enjoyable than Sparking as a whole. But overall, this season still sucks. So let's move on. Where we pick up, however, is with Quad Strike in the Great Tier. Quad Strike is basically a better version of Sparking, at least when it comes to character utilization. Bell's still a little annoying in this season, however, he does improve in the end. What I didn't like about Bell's character is that he was basically insignificant for pretty much the entire season up until maybe like near Iger's battle with Pax, and then it felt like his character was kind of important. I think the art and the animation was also very poor during this season, and the battle choreography is pretty much the same. Just as the animation, it's basically terrible during the beginning of the season. And that's because they're using Hasbro bays. And so basically they've always used Takara Tomy bays in the anime. But since Hasbro ordered this season, they're using Hasbro Beyblades, which are basically clapped versions of Takara Tomy Beyblades with no gimmicks or abilities, which kind of hurt the battles overall as a whole. Because the only gimmicks or abilities they really had were the tip attachment and high mode, both being present on every quad bay. And I think also the pacing was kind of iffy near the middle of the season. I think once we got to the Xander arc, the pacing started to get pretty iffy. However, the start with like the Masquerade tournament to Ken was like good. And I think the pacing started to get better once we got to like that Iger Championship Challenge thing. It started getting okay and then actually started becoming good again. So that was something, I guess. The season, however, does make up for a lot of its shortcomings with a lot of stuff. First of all, Pre and Pax are the best part of the season, the biggest highlights. I think the anime staff did an incredible job with them as characters, and also with the actors for bringing in a lot of personality to the table. I think also the lore building with elemental powers was done exceptionally well. Like, they excel at it a lot. The characters are handled incredibly during this season, and it gave us a lot of depth to them, actually, especially in the case of Pre and Pax. Voice actor work was done very, very well, and overall, I think this season is a great season. You might be wondering, just like GT, why I'd rank this season so high. And the ranking for this season purely comes down to my overall opinion, so there's that, I guess. And finally, we have X, running off the ranking with a pleasantly good season. The season isn't anything amazing, but having a modern Beyblade season that's actually good is something I appreciate, though. The season introduced us to X Tower in Xenon City. This is basically the place in the season where all of the official professional battles are being held. Our new main character, Jackson Cross, is a former champion who quit his team to face the leader of his previous team, just Chrome Ryugu. In order to face Chrome, Jackson must climb his way back into the top of the X Tower to battle Chrome. Alongside Jackson are Robin and Multi to help him achieve his goal. Robin is basically this noob who struggles the entire season to win a battle. Like, actually, he only scored 1 point or something during the entire season, which is kind of crap. And Multi is basically this influencer who battles and is also a bay crafter. I think the season overall struggles with the same issues as the later seasons of Beyblade Burst. It struggles with battle choreography for most of the season, like Quad Strike. The animation style was kind of uninspiring, so just like the art as well. Like, just like every season after Turbo and so on and so forth, I guess, for like its issues. I think this season developed Jackson in a way that was good enough, I guess. He kind of had to share the spotlight with Robin, So it makes sense for him to be less of a developed protagonist than, let's say, someone like Vault or Iger, maybe even Tyson and Jenga. I think Chrome was done okay during this season. Most of his character was explained in flashbacks, so that's why he wasn't as good of an antagonist as, let's say, Fi or Brooklyn. The finale between Robin and Shiru Aminari was handled pretty well and gave us some development for Robin, so that's something. The battle basically ends with Robin losing and Pendragon defeating Persona. However, it's fine because Robin had fun, and that's all that matters. So now for my overall thoughts, I think the Bakuten generation, what it did really well is it basically didn't feel like an advertisement to the toys like any of the modern seasons of Burst or maybe even X. It focuses on good story work and character development. I think the Metal Fight generation focused more on being epic, like having characters being put into conflicts, and they also focused on very solid battles, which were very entertaining, and we're basically almost trying to one-up each other in basically any way possible. I think Burst is more focused on character development and what the characters do. And finally for X, it's basically a mixture of all of these seasons. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you soon with the next video. Peace out.